welcome from Manila, and thank you for joining our ADB, ESCAP, UNDP, HLPF side event on building forward together for the SDGs. My name is Bernard Woods, and I'm the Principal Director for Communications at the Asian Development Bank. As many of you know, our three organizations have a long-standing tripartite partnership aimed at enabling progress towards the SDGs. And each year, as part of that partnership, we produce a joint report that takes stock of the opportunities for SDG attainment in Asia and the Pacific. And this report provides a much needed regional perspective on the theme of the high-level political forum on the SDGs. So this year, our joint report was focused on the efforts that countries are making to emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic and pursue a green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. Over the past 2 years, we've really seen that efforts to contain the pandemic have magnified deeply rooted vulnerabilities and inequalities in the region. And in addition, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has now further disrupted global and regional supply chains and raised food and fuel prices. These compounding crises pose new challenges to our efforts to achieve the SDGs. But in the way that the SDGs are very holistic and interconnected, they may also create new opportunities to accelerate much needed change. So it's with great interest that I'm moderating the session today, which brings together many diverse perspectives on these complex and challenging issues. And we have a very distinguished lineup for you. I should say we're keen to make this an interactive session. So please participate and join in. We'll be using polling questions to get your feedback. And we also want to hear from you. So please ask your questions using the Zoom webinar feature. I'll be compiling those questions, and then we'll have a Q&A section and seek responses from the panel a little later in the program. So to start things off, let me turn first to Armida Alice Jawana. She's Executive Secretary of the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and she will provide a brief overview of some of the headlines from our 2022 report. Over to you, Ibu Armida.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Very good morning, good afternoon, good evening to participants, colleagues, viewers, wherever you are. It is indeed my pleasure to present the SDG Joint Partnership Report 2022, which is our sixth thematic SDG partnership report since 2017. COVID-19 had a significant and wide-ranging socio-economic impact on the country's economies. Indeed, this report will take a closer look at those impacts on SDGs, countries' responses, as well as recommendations to move forward. On the impact of COVID-19, as we are aware, already know, the impact is first and foremost, of course, on the economies of the countries in the region with its different impacts, different impacts as well as the impact on the social aspect of the society of the countries, in the environmental impact. Poverty has been rising, inequality also has been rising, in which has been further exacerbated by the recent and ongoing Ukraine crisis or war. Although since 2020, the later half of 2020, 2021, including 2022, there has been a pickup in the region, although in a different or uneven pace. Let me now turn to the next slide, please. The report is framed by three interconnected areas for policy action, which are inclusion, women's empowerment, environmental sustainability. On inclusion is to ensure social protection and quality education for all. This is related to especially SDG 4, as well as actually SDG 1, women's empowerment, advancing gender equality, which relates to SDG 5, and environmental sustainability, to ensure and to build, especially forward, a more inclusive and resilient green and blue economies, which relate to all SDGs related to environment and climate action, but importantly, SDG 14 and 15. These are underpinned by partnership for the goals. Yeah, these 5 SDGs are the SDG goals that are under review at the high-level political forum this year. Next slide, please. Key factors that influence the dynamics of the recovery, whether the recovery is uneven, and we are also very concerned. Yeah, some of the recovery in some of the countries is taking the so-called K-shape, the uneven recovery. Some sectors, some segment of the society have emerged from the crisis or impact of the crisis. Yeah, the 3 crises. Some are further being impacted adversely or negatively. So the key factors are, first is a vaccination coverage. Second is social protection system coverage. Third is digitalization coverage. Fourth is economic fundamentals or economic structure of the respective economy or countries. Fifth is the link here, the linkages, the close link between ecosystem and human health. This is clearly shown, yeah, by the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, but also the climate change impact. And last but not least is the fiscal position of the government's fiscal space in this regard, yeah, which will determine their ability, the respective government ability to mitigate as well as to adapt, yeah, the economic and social impacts of the pandemic, as well as the climate change, and now the ongoing Ukraine crisis, Ukraine war. Next slide, please. As countries shift, yeah, from emergency response to longer term, more sustainable recovery, therefore they face 2 overriding challenges. The first one is how to ensure this recovery to be more resilient, inclusive, as well as at the same time, how to take the opportunity of this crisis to transform the economy, yeah, as well as not only the economy, but as well as the society to a more, again, towards the transformative path, which is more sustainable and resilient. Yeah. So therefore, 4 policy priorities, yeah, that the study recommended, which is the need for universal social protection system. So the need to scale it up, because not all countries, yeah, have this system in place, and this is needed, yeah, for the economy as well as society, especially to be more resilient to adverse shocks. And second, the need to protect especially the generation of learners because of this learning loss due to the prolonged COVID-19 pandemic, but at the same time also how to transform the education system. Third is the need to advance gender equality, and fourth, the need to build inclusive green economies. As a last note is this report also recommended the raising the ambition of efforts to align policies with SDGs, reinvigorate financing for the SDGs, and redefine and accelerate strengthen regional cooperation, especially to put, yeah, people and planet at the center. So with that, I stop and I hand over back to Bernard. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, Executive Secretary Ibu Armida. I think we all can see the resonance of the 6 drivers and then the 4 policy priorities, especially learning losses. I think that's a critical issue across our region. Let me now turn to Woo Chong who's the Managing Director General of the Asian Development Bank. MD these crises have increased pressure on multilateral development banks in supporting progress on the SDGs in Asia and the Pacific. Could you give us your views on some of the key issues when it comes to financing the SDGs in such turbulent times?
Okay, thank you very much. You can hear me okay, right? Okay. So first of all, thank you very much for having me represent the ADB at this important event. And as we noted in our joint op-ed we published this week, the start of the decade of action to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals has also marked the start of an unprecedented period of overlapping crises. And this continuing COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis of conflict, hunger, climate change, and environmental degradation are mutually compounding, pushing millions of people into acute poverty and health and food insecurity as well. These extraordinary times demand a renewed commitment to the SDGs through the more innovation and responsiveness to the dynamic needs of our region. So a key priority is to help the developing countries manage complex physical challenges, and strengthening financial management remains essential, as well as continued efforts to innovate to help countries cope with the short-term shocks and financing crises. The Asian Development Bank is developing new programs to help our developing member countries deal with the commodity price shocks, build food security, and we need to continue to make progress on systemic issues that impede financing for development in our region. One key agenda is taxation and domestic resource mobilization, with digitalization presenting enormous potential to support national tax reforms. And in addition, we all recognize the need to create an enabling environment for private investment for the SDGs. It has never been more urgent to mobilize development finance from a wider range of sources, particularly capital markets, and we must harness the interest that private sector companies and investors are showing in the SDGs as well. We also need to help investors make full use of the goals as a framework for structuring and channeling financing for sustainable development impact. And alongside raising revenues, we must also address expenditures that may undermine the SDGs. We need to rationalize subsidies in key sectors, particularly energy and agriculture, that encourage reliance on fossil fuels and inefficient consumption and production. We are facing an acute food crisis right now everywhere, but we can and must be a catalyst for an urgent transition to a stronger, more sustainable and equitable global food system for the long term. And we are developing innovative natural capital financing facilities that will seek to build better food systems and promote a more balanced diet. In this context, in 2021, the ADB joined the other multilateral development banks to issue a joint statement on nature, people, and planet. And through this joint statement, we continue to further integrate nature into our work and promote nature-positive investments that reverse the drivers of nature loss and ensure the protection, restoration, and sustainable use of nature to people. Finally, it remains imperative for us to raise our ambitions in tackling the climate change crisis. At the Asian Development Bank, we are delivering on ambitions to provide over $100 billion in climate financing by 2030. We have also committed that 100% of our operations will be aligned to the goals of the Paris Agreement on climate change. And we are the Asia's Climate Bank, and we are working to build the skills and capacities to effectively deliver on this agenda. I look forward to hearing more from my colleagues on the panel about the essential complementarities between the climate and development agendas that this year's IPCC report highlights. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, MD. I think we're going to get into some interesting discussion as you talked about the interplay between natural capital, subsidies, food production. So let me now turn to the third and final member of the tripart partnership, Ms. Claire van der Veren from UNDP, for a view from UNDP on the opportunities to foster systemic change in times of crises in order to address the SDGs. Over to you, Claire.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as the report highlights, as has been mentioned, we're living in an era of polypandemics. The world is confronted by multiple overlapping crises that risk pushing millions into food insecurity and poverty, and governments deeper into debt. These shocks are undermining progress on the SDGs and rolling back human development achievements accrued over decades. The world is experiencing the largest commodity shock since the 1970s. This is already worsening livelihoods through high prices, destabilizing balance of payments, and distressing public finances of a majority of countries in our Asia-Pacific region. This calls for long-term and coherent policies, as well as greater regional cooperation. Let me put forward here two broad messages in this regard. First, dealing with an unprecedented polypandemic demands a set of unconventional policy responses at a time of great uncertainty and human insecurity. Today's challenges, from climate crisis and biodiversity loss to the food, fuel, and finance crisis, are increasingly interlinked. Additionally, the COVID-19 pandemic has revealed the fragilities in the global economy, earthly ecosystems, and social structures. So we now need policy coherence in our responses to confront interwoven challenges. The report we are discussing today illustrates how green and inclusive recovery, protecting a generation of learners, viable social protection systems for all, and gender equality must be at the heart of the development path towards 2030. We need a model of revival that incorporates nature-based solutions and invests in the capabilities of women and men as societies and economies transition into a digital future. Clean energy is at the core of green recovery. The transition to a lower carbon energy system must accelerate in the coming decades. Eliminating environmentally harmful subsidies and promoting cross-subsidization for renewable energy is necessary. Now, it is encouraging that global energy investment is set to increase by 8% this year. However, the recent pressures caused by rising oil prices could reverse some of these trends. A coherent set of policies, again, is necessary to amplify the synergies and minimize the trade-offs among different SDGs. As has been mentioned, inclusion in social protection and education, women's empowerment, and building inclusive and resilient green economies are three essential pillars of a systemic and integrated approach to recovery. The second point I'd like to share with you is that renewed regional cooperation and adequate provision of global and regional public goods are indispensable to complement national policy actions. The international community must anticipate and act to mitigate the severe consequences arising from the acute crisis and shocks. The situation calls for large-scale actions to protect livelihoods and support sustainable food systems. Now, assisting countries that are facing debt distress calls for increased cooperation among public and private stakeholders as a strategic investment mediated by credible international institutions. As less developed economies continue to recover, we must prepare to tackle growing macroeconomic challenges. They need support not only to reform their domestic policies, but also to correct external imbalances. As we embrace a world economy that is uncertain and volatile with increasing frequency of shocks, it is important to foster cooperation by doubling down on investments in the provision of global and regional public goods, including vaccination and concessional aid support. As I close, let me add also that to build resilience, to destabilizing new shocks, those ongoing and those yet unknown, from biodiversity loss to new digital systems, we must envision a new social contract that is adequately funded, but also elicits an elevated level of trust and transparency within societies and across nations. Thank you all.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. van der Veren, for that. Again, thinking about how interlinked crises require a kind of coherent policy response. I think something we can look to build on. So now we've heard from all three organizations in the tripartite partnership. So we want to now hear from you, the audience. So we're going to put up a polling question on the screen. So Ms. van der Veren talked about interlinked crises. What agendas do you think will be the most critical as we navigate these crises and make progress on the SDGs? So of course, all 5 things on the screen that you see are important, but which one do you think is the most important? Is it about the resources, the fiscal reform? Is it about clean energy? Is it about nature-based solutions for agriculture? The governance that pulls all this together, or the private sector engine that helps finance and aligns finance with the SDGs? Okay, so we have the results, and the first one is seen as the highest priority. So really, I think people almost just over a third are seeing that the kind of resources, the finance, bringing more finance to green and inclusive development is very important, but about a quarter thinking about governance. So of course, if these resources come in, you don't have the right governance mechanisms in place, then they are not going to be used efficiently and effectively. Third is the private sector, so a very important private sector engine of growth, of job creations, but one that's aligned with the SDGs and not, as NDG spoke, acting counter to the SDGs. Then we have nature-based solutions for agriculture and food production. Very important, feeding everybody, doing it in a way that supports the planet. And then finally, clean energy. Maybe where I'm thinking that one is the lowest because we do have quite a bit of advancement on that front. So interesting results. I'm sure the panelists will draw from that as we move forward in our discussion. So we've heard from the 3 tripartite members. Let's hear now from the other 3 panel members, and I'll turn to each of them in turn. So the first is Jurashri Roy. She's the lead author of Chapter 5 of the IPCC Working Group 3 6th Assessment Report. This is a report for the 2022 edition that really emphasizes the SDGs as a framework for addressing the critical nexus of climate and development interlinkages. So, Ms. Roy, you know, we have a background of growing energy demand and rising prices. How can countries in the Asia and Pacific region meet the challenge of both supply and access? So we have 150 million people in our region who don't have electricity, but how can we do it in a way that's taking into account climate action aligned with the SDGs? And also, we know men and women consume energy in different ways, and of course, demand for energy is an important part, consumption of energy. So how can the gender impacts of climate change be better integrated into our planning, adaptation, and mitigation efforts? Over to you, Ms. Roy.
Okay, thank you very much. Basically, what we tried to do in this, this is for the first time in the IPCC report, you know, I was co-leading a chapter on demand, services, and social aspects of mitigation. Because we felt that in all earlier IPCC reports, it was more on the supply side, emphasis was that how the supply can be made cleaner in the energy sector. But the huge number of social science literature which are coming up and which could show that how the demand and services are provided to the people, that really matters. on how much energy supply will be needed. So looking into the people's perspective became a very important contribution in the scientific literature. So we tried to look into that literature, and we could see it's very interesting because this is for the first time we can quantify, that by working on the demand side, that means how people demand energy, not only people, but then in their different roles, how the end users sectors use energy, we can see that at least 40 to 70% of emission can be reduced, but without impacting the human well-being. This is the most important thing that we really need to understand. And of course, IPCC report recognizes that some people, at least 25% of the people globally do need more housing, energy, and resources for their well-being. So there will be some rise in consumption of energy, but then that is really not going to impact the global emission reduction of 40 to 70%. So we saw that it is important when we are addressing the inequity issue in consumption to look into the status consumption also. So how did we come up with this 40 to 70%? That's something which is important because that also addresses many of the questions which came up in earlier panelists' talks. So basically, we are saying that people do matter, but for the demand reduction, but it's not people as individual, people in their different roles, people as citizens, people as investor, people as consumer, role models and professionals do matter. And we saw that it's the inequality, top 1% people's consumption contributes 15% of emission, and bottom 90% contributes only 48% of emission. So there is huge inequality in consumption pattern. And so unless we address these, it will be difficult to come up with a balanced development in the future. So what we tried to show is that this is extremely important, that if we look into the services, so we actually saw that what people need. So literature is very clear now that people need services, right? So we need access to our jobs, we need access to our medical facility, we need access to our educational facilities, etc. And we need nutrition. So if we take a service perspective, then we can see that the same level of nutrition can be provided with much less energy because there is a food waste reduction is possible. So we could see that if we reduce waste in whether food, whether material or energy, there is huge gain in the process, because at least 45% of upstream emission can be reduced just by looking into the waste reduction. And this waste reduction, it cannot come only by the people's choice, but there has to be more incentive, there has to be infrastructure for providing these waste reduction facilities and end-use technology adoption. Just to show you that in the nutrition, actually the direct reduction of food-related emission, if we reduce the food waste and go for healthy, sustainable consumption, which is rich in nutrition, like reducing the excessive meat consumption, then and healthy meat consumption is of course needed. For that, what we could see is that there will be a lot of land which will be released and which can be used for afforestation and reforestation also. So we could see that in the nutrition sector, there is huge possibility of reduction in the socio-cultural factors, which can lead to reduction in the consumption and land use change. And of course, there is need for infrastructure use also, so that there can be reduction in emission. But if we look into the other sectors, then it is maybe in the building sector, it is more of end-use efficient technology accessibility. So when we are meeting the energy demand, are we giving the most efficient technology to the user? This is really important. So if we look into that point of view, for the land transport, actually, whether we have access to a walkable city, that really matters, how the cities are planned. So if we look into these, then we saw that if we consider that how urban design is done, infrastructure is planned, whether there is more green and blue infrastructure, then looking through all the SDGs, they have positive impact. And if we look at the waste reduction, we see that across all SDGs, they have positive impacts. So these are extremely important, that just focusing on these mitigation actions, we can advance the SDGs. And if we look into the well-being also, all blue colors show that how the well-being impact is also going to be positive. So demand side reduction through technology access and infrastructure access can provide SDG benefit and human well-being benefit. So I'll just stop here, and I'll say that we can take any questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Roy. Some interesting insights into food waste reduction, land use, and the demand question. So we have a couple more speakers before we get to the Q&A section, but can I just encourage you in the audience to please submit any questions you might be having, and we will then present those to the panel. So next, we just talked about food waste, agriculture, a critical issue. We're very honored to have Ms. Beverly Postma, who's the Executive Director of Grow Asia. So Ms. Postma, you lead Grow Asia, which is a unique multi-stakeholder platform that seeks to cultivate more inclusive, resilient, and sustainable food systems in Southeast Asia. We've talked a lot already in this session about these converging crises, energy crises, debt sustainability, and both of these linked to food production and food prices. So we know, of course, industrial intensive agriculture feeds a lot of people, but it comes at great cost to the climate, to biodiversity, to the soil, and often to communities. So for you, what does a just transition in food production and agriculture systems look like? One that both protects communities while moving to a green, resilient, and climate neutral society.
Thank you, Bernard, and thank you everyone for joining. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whichever time zone you're joining in. It's a great honor to join this esteemed panel of experts, and I find myself nodding away at all of the remarks. I think we're seeing lots of red threads across these very diverse speakers, and I find everything very relatable to the challenges that we're facing every day here at Grow Asia. Thankfully, now the skies are a little more open. We have finally been able to get into the field to visit some of our more than 600 partners and stakeholders across the region. And yes, indeed, we find ourselves in a very challenging landscape of these converging crises. I would dare to say we find ourselves in unprecedented times due to the complexity and the impact of these crises, at least that I've experienced in my lifetime. We've heard many moving and troubling examples of the human impacts of the global pandemic, and these obviously have been compounded by a now intensifying environmental crisis, with very visible, especially in this part of the world, and very irreversible at times, biodiversity loss. And of course, we are feeling and seeing the continued onslaught of climate change. Now, when we layer on the new, and I think as yet unknown extent of the disruption caused to the global food system and the fertilizer supply chains by the invasion of Ukraine, we would, I think, all be forgiven for despairing at this very bleak landscape that we see before us, especially those of us that are working with the most marginalized communities in this space. Many of us, I think, are questioning the feasibility of achieving the 17 Sustainable Development Goals by 2030, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, where we have to state that the odds were already stacked against us before these latest climate and financial shocks. However, like many of the speakers before me, I believe it is premature to translate these impacts all the way into fatalism for the region or for the world. If anything, for the first time in my 30-year career in the global food system, I'm seeing some very, very real signs that the urgency is prompting us to shift at an individual level, at a consumer level, at a national level, at a sectoral level, but as a global community, from talking and trying to understand the challenges ahead of us into converting that into really rapid, scalable, and joined up action. And while many resources are still quite rightfully being diverted to respond to emergency and humanitarian responses and needs in the region, I'm seeing an equally robust effort to build long-term partnerships and transform systems that are geared towards deep, long-term resilience and recovery. The good news is that we have many of the solutions that will allow us to build forward together. And as it's so clearly articulated in the partnership report, the way we can harness these solutions is to shift towards reshaping systems through partnership, including our global food system, which many of us know needs quite an urgent redeployment of resources and ideas. It requires us to embrace these two principal imperatives that are stated in the report. How do we chart an irreversible path towards more sustainable and resilient economies in the region? And how do we ensure that this recovery is inclusive and leaves no one behind? Now, these two imperatives, that they lie at the very heart of Grow Asia's mission. In fact, they were the reason why Grow Asia was created in the first place by two quite unlikely parents. Back in 2014, the World Economic Forum and the 10 member states of ASEAN at the agricultural minister level knew that economic, social, and environmental transformation in the region would not be possible unless all parties work together. Businesses, governments, civil society, we need to join forces and challenge some of the silos that were holding us back. And it's no coincidence, therefore, that 8 years later, Grow Asia's new regional flagship programs and our multi-donor impact funds are attracting investment from a very diverse pool of actors. And these flagships are 100% aligned with the priorities identified in this year's SDG partnership report. We know that supporting a just transition to sustainable and resilient economies requires that all interventions must be inclusive. We need to engage all sectors, including the most marginalized in society, have a strong focus on women's economic empowerment, moving from maybe a cross-cutting imperative to a deep and narrow focus, a vertical imperative, to advance gender equality and equity across particularly marginalized groups. And three, we must be centered around building inclusive green economies, linking the green trade agenda to delivering long-term environmental sustainability in the region. We also know without doubt that accelerated transition cannot be achieved without multi-stakeholder collaboration. SDG 17 is now more important than ever. And although it's difficult, we have evidence every day that it's possible. The theme of this event and this year's report is build forward together. This means, I think, we all have a duty every day to challenge any remaining silos and dismantle them, and do what we can to embrace all views and diverse opinions, work across all sectors, across regions, across countries, and across multiple different organizations, and really identify and recognize those silos and know when we're in one, know when the echo chamber is preventing us from moving faster with others that may share our same ambition. We know that with roughly 55 million smallholder farmers in the Southeast Asian region alone, the agriculture sector here has immense potential to reduce poverty, tackle gender inequalities, and meet the climate challenge. I'd be more than happy to share examples of some of the collaboration and action that I'm seeing, whether it's across gender, whether it's across digital solutions, inclusive finance, and bringing more climate smart technologies into the hands of these small and medium-sized enterprises. We know that if we unlock the economic potential of these businesses in rural communities, we have, I think, a real hope to build forward together and to unlock just the sheer optimism that exists in these communities if we work together. So I'll pause there because I know we're tight for time, but thank you very much. I look forward to the questions later.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Postma. Maybe we can come back to some of those points during the Q&A. So the final panel member for this section that we want to hear from is Mr. Alkesh Wadhwani. He's from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and leads the foundation's poverty alleviation programs in India. So thinking about COVID-19, we know that the effect of COVID-19 on poverty, it's been well documented. And we know that the pandemic has exposed many fault lines in our societies, with poverty and affluence being one of those fault lines. So poverty alleviation, poverty eradication is now more critical than ever. So Mr. Wadhwani, with the pandemic and these other crises layered on top of them, how have these changed efforts to eradicate poverty? And how does a focus on the SDGs then help us to build forward better?
Thank you, Bernard. It's a pleasure to be here. Many of my panelists have talked about issues such as social safety nets, food insecurities, and gender inequality. And perhaps these are three areas which are linked to the SDGs and have been most impacted by the pandemic. What I'd like to do is talk about some micro actions that we've seen the government of India take, and in some of them where we work jointly with them to try and alleviate poverty, because for us, these form the heart of the challenge that the pandemic and of course, perhaps made worse by the war have caused. So if I, first look at the gender inequality, labor force participation rates in India have been falling and have as low as 24% before the pandemic, and perhaps have become worse during the pandemic. Similarly, if we look at farmers, especially smallholder farmers who are most effective, maybe 80–85% of them have less than 2 acres of land. And you've, I'm sure, heard of the feminization of farming, where if you look at areas such as livestock, more than 70% of livestock is done by women, and women are really involved in the livestock sector. So the question is, how do we get social safety nets going for these kind of populations? And how do we increase their earnings and productivity? And we've seen that you need a lot of micro actions and plumbing to really do this. So let me say that literally in the first month of the epidemic, or perhaps 2 months, the Indian government was able to get more than 200 million women to receive direct benefit transfers, which is a good way of, a social safety net. And that required a lot of plumbing. It didn't happen automatically. There were many schemes that contributed to it, many programs. The first was there was an ID system. That took at least 5 to 10 years to build out. And that's what really enabled this. The second was that there was financial inclusion, another program the government focused on, which helped to open 250 million accounts in a short span of 5 years. In both of these, there were there were exclusion challenges, there were inclusion challenges. And what we found is that that's the kind of plumbing you need to focus on. We were able to work in many programs with the government to say, look, let's do the surveys, let's see what are the failure rates, what are causing these failure rates, what do we need to do to change the processes. And doing that kind of, I would call it work, which is not exciting, it's not sexy, but that's what really needs to be done to see that in a very short period of time, 200 million families can get money at a moment's notice. But let me move to other micro actions. So like I said, the challenge is women are affected disproportionately. And farming is perhaps constitutes the largest sector of employment in India. Maybe more than 100 million households are in farming, which would be give or take half the population of India, maybe slightly less. Of the working population, at least it's a large proportion. And what we find here is the big challenge is again, that it's not economically viable to do farming when you're holding 1 or 2 acres. And I say it's not economically viable because with such small holdings, how do you get access to inputs? Markets don't want to serve you on inputs, markets don't want to serve you on outputs. So again, the micro actions that one needs to take is really about things like saying, how do we aggregate farmers? Now there are well-known models, but the issue is how do you scale it up? And there are many examples we see where we work with the government to say there are scalable models that can very easily increase incomes. So I'll give you one very basic example. So one of the things we work with the government on is on maize FPOs. And what we found is that what you really need to do is to give the FPOs moisture meters, because maize is sold and the price depends on the moisture content of maize. So without moisture meter, the trader will take the maize, put it to his teeth and bite it to see how dry it is. Now there are clearly error rates in that and you can't do much there. So simple things like moisture meter works. Similarly, the government has done a lot on SDG groups. There are now over 100 million women in SDG groups. And these groups have got credit worth $20 billion outstanding in the last year or so. Of course, it's a 10-year program. So these are the kind of micro actions we feel are important to drive income, and when taken at scale can have a huge impact on poverty. And we've been fortunate that the government has taken many of these actions and we've had an opportunity to partner with them. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Wadhwani. Interesting juxtaposition of the kind of society level plumbing needed to get resources to those in need with some very micro level actions there. So I'd like to thank the 6 panel members very much for sharing their thoughts and experience. I think we can see that we have tremendous interlinked crises facing us. But I think there's also opportunities for the SDGs to guide us in addressing these crises and the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. So we want to make this as interactive as possible. So we'll spend the next few minutes going through your questions from the audience. So let me turn to Ms. Joyashree Roy for the first question. The question is, with rapid urbanization and rising middle income classes in the region, there's going to be increased consumption and waste. So against this backdrop, what kind of policy actions would you recommend to both moderate food consumption and reduce food waste?
Yeah, this is very relevant question. So what I say usually is that when in this part of the world, every day some decision is taken for building an infrastructure or building a new town or new urban center, there is possibility of integrating and thinking of active transport mode and active transport infrastructure, so walkable city and compact city and cycling lanes into the whole system. So once you have that in place for intermediate transport, you will not need the fossil fuel technology for your mobility. You can have a very good, comfortable public transit system, which reduces the need for car-based lifestyle. And we have come up with all these examples in the IPCC report and from different parts of the world, how it has happened. Even in pandemic, the countries which built their active mobility, because that was what people were needing for intermediate transport to avoid public transit system. So they built walkable and cycling lanes, immediately repurposed their existing infrastructure towards these. So this is one example in the mobility sector which I'm giving. In the food sector, so that there can be policies that where the how the labeling of the food in the supermarkets are done, so that there is less waste before the expiry date. So you can send them to the food bank so they do not get wasted. So you need to have a right infrastructure for food recycling, so that if there is still some waste, that can be recycled. And when you are providing new so with increasing middle income classes, what we expect is that their demand for energy using appliances will be increasing. Why can't we have all labeled appliance standards, so that each and every appliance used is the most efficient one, so there is least waste in the energy use? So I think there are several ways how we can do it. So it's not about the people's behavior alone. Whether you are giving them access to the right infrastructure, whether you are giving them access to the right policy and social norms, and the access to the appliances, whether they're available in the market, what is the pricing system, what is the incentive mechanism there is. If we go to the restaurants, do we get a smaller portion to buy, not just big portion? So there is several ways. We have identified 60 such options in the chapter 5 of IPCC, which can be implemented and where the policy intervention is also needed. So this is something which is not just individual behavior or choice, but how policy and infrastructure and technology access really makes a change.
Thank you very much for that. So I think everybody should go and look at that menu of the 60 options or alternatives to put these measures into place. Let me turn next to Ms. van der Veren from UNDP. So as we're coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, we see differing recovery paths for countries in the Asia and the Pacific region. What are the priorities for UNDP and the UN system to promote an equitable recovery across the region?
Very much, Bernard. I think maybe three things in response. First, of course, we recognize that there are different country typologies in our region, LDCs, LLDCs, SIDS, and of course, middle-income countries of various ranges. So I think the first thing that we do is we support countries with analysis, diagnostics of their macroeconomic fundamentals in partnership with based on macroeconomic fundamentals in partnership with other development actors, Bretton Woods institutions and others, to identify where are the key pressure points and triangulate this, to link this with vulnerability analysis. So that's sort of understanding where the pressure points are, helping countries sort of identify, therefore, where are the key opportunities and levers that can help address these issues. Second is to help countries identify costs, and put in place broad social protection measures that enable, for example, a temporary basic income or other measures of this nature, like, for example, we're doing working with Sri Lanka, among others. And then, so to make sure that the sort of the loss to livelihoods and income is staved off. And then the third dimension is support deeper, so structural, addressing some of the structural imbalances and issues, challenges specific in each of these countries across multiple dimensions depending on what the needs are. Economic diversification is one, particularly in export-led economies that have suffered greatly from the disruption to value chains as a result of the COVID pandemic, but also the most recent crisis. Helping countries develop SDG-based financing instruments like green bonds, supporting the energy transition. I think this has been mentioned by multiple speakers today, but also, as has also been highlighted, supporting the participation of women in the economy through the MSME sector, but also in a variety of other ways, giving them, facilitating their access to finance and skills. I think in that it's important, and there's a point in the chat that has been raised, that this all provides an opportunity to interlink climate resilience and economic recovery by promoting employment that is in the, for example, energy transformation area, or other or nature-based economic activities that enable countries to pursue in an integrated manner. And the interlinkage, I think, has been highlighted. The importance of interlinkage of policies has been highlighted to interlink what makes the economy greener and more resilient, what makes it more inclusive, and what makes it sort of better able to, what makes the country better able to build forward better. Back to you.
Thank you so much for that. So we have maybe about 5 minutes left for the Q&A. I'm going to try and squeeze in 3 questions, optimistic of me. So if I can ask you just to keep your responses shorter. First question is for you, Ibu Armida. This is a technical, perhaps technical SDG question. So how are the national and global frameworks being managed for the SDGs to ensure that SDG targets now take into considerations the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic? So how is COVID-19 filtering into that SDG framework with respect to targets and that type of thing?
Yeah, so certainly COVID-19 has impacted first and foremost is through the health related aspect. Second is again, the need for social protection, the need to protect the most vulnerable. That is second. And third is also how to recover in a different way, a more resilient, inclusive, and sustainable. Those are the 3, I believe, the lessons learned coming out of pandemic, although we are not quite coming out of the pandemic. And with that, to prioritize to the respective SDG related. Of course, all SDGs are important, but those 3 elements, then how to reflect that to prioritize in the respective related SDGs. Again, the social protection, protect the most vulnerable, and to recover in a more resilient, sustainable, and to leverage the opportunity which is digital. And 3 point is youth and women. I think those are the lessons learned. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that. So next question to Ms. Postma. This is about indigenous peoples and their vulnerability and marginalization. So, of course, you know, for indigenous people, leaving no one behind means a recognition and the issues related to ancestral land rights and rights to natural resources. How do you see these rights being ensured related to your work and government policies or the absence of government policies at the country or the community level?
Thank you very much. It's a very important question and one that is incredibly challenging in Southeast Asia. I think we have lessons to learn from countries and regions elsewhere, but we need to shine a spotlight on the barriers that are preventing us moving forward on resolving some of these challenges, not just for indigenous peoples, but all marginalized communities that are so essential to the production of food in this part of the world, and also to the protection of biodiversity and nature and ecosystems. So first of all, we start by acknowledging the vital role that these communities play. We've seen it in many value chains in the work that Grow Asia has done. We are simply not able to deliver a viable, resilient and inclusive solution if we don't engage indigenous peoples and those that represent them at the decision-making level. So it starts with, while it's challenging for us all to work across silos, to actually listen, include and understand what are the barriers and what are the solutions. And I wanted to showcase some of the things that we think are working. I mean, first of all, we have to recognize that we've got to stop sort of romanticizing the idea of smallholder farmers. These are businesses. And like any micro and small and medium-sized enterprise, businesses need the viable tools of business to grow. And this includes businesses that are led by indigenous communities, whether it's growing crops within a plantation environment in Indonesia, whether it's working on the shores as fisher folk and those that are bringing in food from other sources. But we have to recognize that in most cases, we're talking about a micro business. And we've learned how to empower micro businesses. We have to, first of all, take every individual context in its own unique space. That we've got to stop broad brushing solutions. We've got to sit and solve a problem, just like any big business would solve a problem. First of all, you have to put the right people in the room to identify the problem. And that usually includes quite diverse actors that are not that good at being in the same room. So it often needs an honest broker. And that's what Grow Asia does, to convene the right people in a room or across a region to identify the problem we're trying to solve. Then we need to take a very sprint-like methodology to provide solutions and to follow through those solutions for that community, for that crop, for that value chain, for that country. We cannot do this without policymakers involved. Government needs to be in the room, but they're only one part of the solution. Big business needs to be in the room, however uncomfortable that is for some people. Banks need to be in the room. Financial services need to be in the room. Technology providers need to be in the room. But we have to convene those groups, not as generalists, but as individuals that uniquely can solve that unique problem for that unique community. And I think we are now finally seeing this methodology working and yielding results, but we have to hold everyone to account. And that's why the honest broker piece is so important. And we need to champion that so that it works, because that's the only way we're going to avoid greenwashing and moving into more difficult territories. Thank you for your question.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think there's a couple more questions, but I think in the interest of time, we have to move on. So I'd like to come now back to the panel for some final reflections. Again, we've talked about these interlinked crises. We know the challenges that are facing us. Hopefully in that we're not fatalistic. There's some room for pessimism, for optimism, sorry, to move forwards on these. And the SDGs do present a framework that can provide us with those integrated solutions. So I'm going to ask each of you if you can just keep your final reflections to 2 or 3 minutes. That would be very much appreciated. And let me turn first to Ms. Joyashree Roy. The floor is yours.
Yeah, we wrote a report last year where we showed that actually the COVID-19 recovery resource mobilization, of that, only 10% is needed to fix the climate change problems. So what it means is that if we can take the 10% of the recovery package globally for green or climate-friendly investment, which is both mitigation and adaptation and sustainable development, where there is an intersection of these three, then we can have a recovery as well as address the climate adaptation, mitigation, and sustainable development. So that is most important. I can just give one example. Suppose through digitalization and work from home, we got used to many new work to be done, and for which the mobility through fossil fuel, automobility reduced. So we can include those in our day-to-day routine of doing our work and services. But for that, what we also need is active mobility for keeping good health. So how you combine these things and the infrastructure development decisions, how can we take that is extremely important. That's a real lesson that we learned from COVID-19. And so these are the ways how we can find out where there is a triple win of mitigation, adaptation, and sustainable development. And we have identified those triple wins in IPCC report this time. So I would really urge that we really need to look into that, and then we can identify those triple wins and go ahead with that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. So the resources are there, and we need to look at triple wins. Mr. Alkesh Wadhwani, could I have your final reflections?
Sure. So I'd make just a few points. The first is that agriculture, especially the way smallholder farmers have been hit, is very important. And some, let's say, macro actions need to be taken, which would include R&D, especially on the climate side. And we've seen in India that ICAR, which is the Indian Council for Agricultural Research, has been able to, for example, get seeds out which are drought resistant. They've been able to get biofortified seeds out. So these kind of actions are really important to try and address the problems, especially for smallholder farmers. The second is we really need to focus on women because they've been disproportionately impacted. And again, the intersection of women with smallholder farmers, given the feminization of agriculture, is critical. And here we need to find ways to see that they get as much access to inputs, credits, and outputs as men get. Our data shows us they don't get it, and therefore yields are for women. Agriculture is 20 to 30% less than the same for men. We need to focus on closing that gap. So I would say these are the two main actions. And if I had to say a third, which is to say we really need to continue the social safety nets that were there in the COVID and not stop them prematurely, just given that the bounce back hasn't happened fully.
Thank you. So resources involve women and maintain social safety nets. Ms. Postma, could you share your final thoughts on the critical area of agriculture?
Yes, first of all, I'm going to take an action myself that I've pledged as a result of participating in this. I spend a lot of time talking about breaking down silos and knowing when we're in one. And I've realized that I don't always see the wealth of information, resource, and tools that are accessible to all of us. And I want to commend the tripartite, the three organizations that have come together. I rather belatedly spent some time on your respective libraries. And boy, was I blown away by the quality of the reports and the data that is available between those three. And my question to myself is, well, if it's my job to know this stuff, I'm supposed to broker these relationships. And if I don't know the quality and the value of this material, how can I help to share that to the world? So my first commitment and action I take from this is to find a way to make sure that these data reach a wider audience, including the private sector, especially now as they're trying to focus on their own ESG disclosures and how investors can play more of a meaningful role in delivering sustainable outcomes, because we don't want to reinvent the wheel. The data exists, the solutions exist, the recommendations exist. So I think one of the things we all have to do is challenge ourselves. Are we sharing these solutions in a meaningful way with a wide enough audience? And my second commitment, and I think this is something that I really see as part of the urgency of the situation we find ourselves, is I'd like to start posing slightly different questions about how we solve these problems. We know that the 55 million smallholders in Southeast Asia are going to be the most impacted by climate change and are really feeling the shocks already from the supply chain disruptions from the Ukraine invasion. We were speaking to smallholders who've already run out of fertilizer and have no way of getting it and don't really understand why. The dynamics of the global food system are very difficult to understand when you're a farmer in West Kalimantan and growing coconuts. And so we've got to find a way of involving these businesses in our conversations in a more readable way. And we've started to pose a question that I think engages them and the business community, and say, what will it take to unlock the economic power of Asia's 55 million smallholders, not just as suppliers of sustainable ingredients, but as buyers of climate smart solutions? And that's my sort of take-home action and my take-home question. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Well, I think the whole purpose of this event is around the dissemination of information and knowledge, so we can certainly build on that and also ask ourselves that second question. Turning to Ms. van der Veren, from UNDP's perspective, could we hear your final reflections?
Thanks very much, Bernard. First, let me say that the partnership report we were discussing today, I think, is a good example of the investment in collaboration I was mentioning earlier, that is helping bring together integrated analysis and inform policy choices from multiple angles, and that is really valuable and important, and we're committed to this partnership. I think the report has suggested, I think it bears repeating, 3 core areas for policy action that lend themselves particularly well to interlinkages and multiplier effects and can contribute to the full implementation of the SDGs: inclusion, women's empowerment, and ensuring economic growth that is green, inclusive, and risk-informed. I think we've also recognized through our discussion today that the 2030 agenda had the foresight to recognize the importance of having global goals as interconnected systems rather than as siloed sectors. And the COVID-19 pandemic has further underscored the interconnection of the SDGs and the importance of the multilateral system to address them. So I think we have reconfirmed that the SDGs remain the blueprint. And as the theme for the HLPF's, this year's HLPF advocates, it is only in the full implementation of the SDGs that we can realize the ambition to build back better and to leave, or to leave, build forward better and to leave no one behind. And in closing, a big vote of thanks from me to you, Bernard, for moderating us, and to my fellow panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. So interconnected problems and challenges require interconnected solutions as presented by the SDGs. MDG could I turn to you now and ask you for your final thoughts and comments?
Yeah, thank you very much, Bernard. Yeah, first of all, I'd like to thank all the panel members for an incredibly insightful discussion. And just on overall context, this collaboration is really, really important. Not just the three collaborators in this publication, but everybody. In terms of keeping our developing countries stay focused on keeping long-term objectives intact, especially along the lines of the SDGs, which is very much aligned with ADB's long-term strategy. And because of the urgent pandemic and crisis, there's a temptation for many of our developing countries to sort of abandon or forget about the long-term sustainability and just focus on putting out the fire in front of us. And that was we could see that last year, a year and a half ago, in the deep lockdown stages, where some of the developing countries wanted to stop everything else, like all climate and everything, all climate work, until this pandemic is over. But when we had deeper discussion with the countries, they did realize that we cannot forget about the long-term objectives, because those will not go away, and we can come out of the COVID-19 by building better, greener, so that we can stay on course for long-term vision, at the same time be able to cope with the short-term crisis that's at hand, and also try to look at this as an opportunity where we can actually push some of the agenda that was not moving as fast. For example, in terms of education, digital education, digitalization. We were all thrown into the deep end in terms of working remotely. So I think we can have a huge progress in digital education. And also the independence from fossil fuel. There's of course there's a short-term crisis, but gives us more incentive for all of us to promote green energy, so that there's less dependence on the fossil fuel, and there are many more opportunities. So we have to continue this dialogue with this kind of format, but also have a very focused discussion with the specific countries as well.
Great, thank you very much, MDG. And then finally, Ibu Armida, maybe I can ask you for your reflections on the sessions today.
Yes, thank you very much, Bernard. Thank you to all panelists, speakers, as well as viewers, participants, for your insightful thoughts as well as questions. And secondly, just a quick 3 points here on reflection of all the discussions. First is, I think we should not forget the precondition for all of this, which is macroeconomic stability. Of course, this is not particularly highlighted in the report, but this is a very important preconditions, and we've been seeing that countries that have not had yet this prudent macroeconomic policy stability, those are the countries that have immense difficulty in mitigating the impact of all these shocks, climate, pandemic, as well as the war in Ukraine. Secondly is to further leverage all the creative, innovative solutions that have been coming up. Again, we've been hearing this digitalization and the youth, the young generation, women, SMEs and so on, startups. So how to further leverage these good opportunities, because this will contribute to employment, better livelihoods, as well as it relates to climate action. Third, and my last point is, again, there is this recommendation on how to strengthen, scale up regional cooperation, in which, again, us at ESCAP, we are especially facilitating our member states to forge a stronger regional cooperation. But I think let's move in a concrete manner, walk the talk, in this regard. So let's build the confidence among countries, among member states, especially in our region, with concrete deliverables. Start with low-hanging fruits, whether it's climate action, energy transition, nature-based solution, and so on. Then at the end of the day, we need to walk the talk, concrete solution deliverables. Then it will build the confidence of countries, and it will be much easier to scale up all the solutions that have been recommended. Again, thank you very much. It's been a real great pleasure to work in partnership with all of you. Thank you very much.
Great, and thank you, Ibu Armida. So concrete solutions to build confidence, I think, is a fantastic way to end off thinking of building forwards together. So this completes our program. So I want to say thank you to the audience. Thank you to all the panelists for your insightful contributions. The COVID-19 pandemic has really been a wake-up call for all of us. It's left many countries exposed and vulnerable. And the Russian invasion of Ukraine, layered on top of that, the effects and impacts of that have really caused these interlinked crises, challenges that we've talked about. But I think our speakers have reminded us from the kind of macro, meso, micro level that really we need to refocus on the SDGs and look at the SDGs as a framework for fostering systemic change, the systemic change required to address these interlinked crises. Just to say on that note that next year's report will look at energy, food, and financing nexus. So really looking at how these issues come together, and will propose concrete solutions to innovate for the SDGs. So I'd just like to say thank you again very much for joining us, for your time and for your interest, for your questions. Stay safe and good night from Manila. Thank you.